Hello everyone, today we continue our Saga of Harald Hardrada's series that I started in September in 3 chunks. Today we look at the history of the Norwegian leader from his entering in Byzantine military service until the preparations for the 1066 British campaign. Right, so needless to say, I already made a video about the Battle of Hastings. I talked about the sort of the final subjugation of the Anglo-Danish in Britain after the Norman victory. But there is that very important part, of course, of British and Scandinavian history connected with Harald Hardrada's, I don't need to spoiler anything because everybody knows that, in any case, campaign to England. That is considered a bit like also the end, ideally, at least, of the so-called Viking era. All right, so today we get probably in the middle of the journey with Harald's peak of fame, power, glory. Obviously, I think there is, as you know, at the end of the videos, I normally check if anyone has ever covered this topic, and of course I know, even without searching, that lots of people talked about Harald Hardrada. In fact, also this series is mostly intended to, of course, mostly focus on his personal epopee. However, also to frame a bit the broader picture. At some point, we will make more videos, say the Battle of Stamford Bridge itself for our, in fact, battle series, reconstructing it from primary sources. We'll talk about, there's actually a fourth episode in the series. I will not spoil what that is. In any case, there is definitely a lot to cover in terms of Viking warfare. You know that on Schwerpunkt, I haven't really talked about Viking history that much, at least. There is, at this point, some solid Scandinavian history content. However, we have to get a bit more into the depths of medieval Scandinavia. And I think videos like this definitely help. They're paving the way. You know that I'm basically doing this, all the specials, especially I launched now, even more in particular, the sort of, I can say, marathon of the holiday season, so to say. But there's going to be a pretty dense concentration of specials that have the function of laying those cornerstones for a sort of higher, sort of highway military history, so to say, on which, in fact, we can grab so many different episodes, details, and so on in depth. Some topics like Harald Hardrada we had never covered, so I felt this was epic and obvious enough for the purpose. Now, everything we needed to say in terms of background, context, etc. is in the first episode. You can easily find it in the Medieval Scandinavia playlist. Here we are at the arrival of Harald in Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, and known to the Norse as Miklagard, meaning the great city. Imagine this vision, like especially from places like Northern Europe in the 11th century, right? We often underestimate, probably not even with this enormous margin of error, the relative sort of importance of this great arc that stretched, in fact, from, say, even the Celtic fringe in the west to the Black Sea in the east, like a crescent that gets really a lot of attention, I think, because, say, probably I realized in absolute terms, not even Viking history is very well or even much discussed, I think, and it's way more interesting than the usual narratives, at least even those who try to say, but you always hear the usual narratives, and then they stick to the usual narratives. Unfortunately, YouTube has turned mostly into this. So even though this video is relatively general, we make a bit of criticism regarding the this space that I say it's probably overrated in terms of what was actually happening in the continent as a whole, in the West, in Central Europe, in Southern Europe, and not just the Byzantines, right? If you look really at, the magic trios, France, Germany, Italy, lots of things were starting to properly expand from this broader Franco-Roman civilization, let's say, including the 1066 crusade against the Anglo-Danes in Britain. And so we should really talk more about that exactly, also to dispel a bit these weird subcultural trends, like people still thinking, I don't know, that the Normans were the Vikings, essentially, and that, you can't just frame narratives about this house or another just merely in some abstract sort of frame that you can make up essentially today without any broader international, political, or sort of moral, even horizon. We're looking at a world that will actually be defeated. So even though the saga of the great Norse leader coming to Constantinople, this immense power that it was indeed, is quite fascinating, reflect on also how increasingly fringe, especially this northeastern corridor, was becoming. We discussed this also in the videos about Byzantine evangelization, in fact, of basically the Balkans, Eastern Europe, even further, like the Khazars back in the day, while all the rest was being taken over by Rome and a much powerful civilization that essentially less than 200 years later will have actually conquered Constantinople. So you want to appreciate this. We've seen the comparison even in the Battle of the Varangian. It is obvious in the Battle of Hastings, all right, just for chapters that we already covered, especially in this critical sense, especially Hastings. We haven't made the tactical analysis through primary sources, but even the Battle of the Varangian, but with it, like, shows very much this massive bath of blood of the Varangian Guard. At that point, also all the Anglo-Danish refugees that had, in fact, fled over to Constantinople. It's not just in search for fortune, but also in an anti-Norman policy after the debacle of 1066. However, the magnificent Miklagard of Norse lore is something fascinatingly described, in fact, in the same Scandinavian sagas, in terms that really render us back that sense of essentially of primitivity that also, even in the most advanced parts of the world, like this era really was. Things like, I don't know, the thorough descriptions of arms and armor that some Varangian leaders were gifted with by the same Byzantine emperor for their service in his in fact, bodyguard. We made some videos about the Varangian Guard as such. I think one of the most underrated aspects of the Norse presence in the Byzantine Empire is not much the sort of video game-like idea of the picked force of Norse guardsmen. Actually, there were so many different good guards around there that do not get the sort of the same coverage, the same appreciation for reasons that are mostly modern and sort of a bit detached from the history itself. But the Scandinavian presence as soldiers and settlers in the Balkans, aside from the picked unit with the guy with a double-handed axe, just for making an example, and that's a dynamic of migration, of settlement, of recruitment that actually did have a very important role in the Byzantine Empire. So as we've seen also in the previous chapter, we do not know exactly all the details, all the chronology of Harald Hardrada's life. He, however, got to Constantinople around 1033 or 1034, accompanied by a force of roughly 500 loyal warriors who had shared his earlier exile and service in Kievan Rus. This was essentially a regiment on his own, and it's privately connected with the leader. This echoes again in the fantasy, in the excitement of the war bands of the migration era in earlier times that in great part also Norse culture had remained based on at this point in other parts of Europe, but also in Scandinavia. The difference was just by degree was turning to something more professional, more mounted, for example, more heavily armored, etc. In fact, we don't have to think this force was just about, for example, the picked heavy footmen, right, with devastating weapons. We described actually the variety that existed, including also cavalry forces, and especially the leaders were skilled, as we know, in the use of any weapon, in combat in any circumstance, in any theater. And Harald Hardrada is perhaps really the best example of this, because also he was accompanied by the Byzantine military that was able to exalt strategically, tactically, logistically this Norse troops' potential, right? Also committing them in very bloody ways, right? That these guys, however, were incredibly rewarded for. And this is what all the sagas in an ideal concept were thinking of. This is like the Nibelungenlied, the hero that goes out there in an impossible mission, just out in quest of glory and winning heaven in the process against all odds. This is essentially the late Viking era, as we obviously know also from Harald Hardrada's sort of life itself. So things were getting tendentially more professional, more organized, less sort of individually based. However, still by sort of the overall European standards, especially the ones of Byzantine civilization, the idea that these were individual warriors as leaders, like proving themselves as the excellence in terms of fighting skills and so on, was very, very important. We've seen it just for some decades later with the Saint Tancred of Seville, a Norman, but in that sense also very close to already that sort of high rather than late medieval sense of leadership. And there you find also made videos about the Italo-Norman heavy cavalrymen. We talked about crusade tactics and so on. And there is definitely a blend between sort of the Varangian guard and the Norman mercenaries in terms, in part even of provenance. That is true, even though they were at this point really two different things. But in terms of properly overlapping also in tactical function and theaters of deployment and so on. As you know, the Kievan Rus, from which partly his forces came from, were not thus entirely Norse, but also Slavic, was the powerful medieval, in fact, Eastern Slavic state that we made many videos on, centered on Kiev, ruled at the time by the Grand Prince Yaroslav the Wise. We've seen his relation with Harald Hardrada. Harald Sigurd's son, that's in fact to be remembered as Hardrada, meaning hard ruler. There's a debate in the etymology there as well. And the fact he wasn't actually called like that in life, but still sort of passed down to history with this name, reflecting his stern and ruthless style of governance. And in part, this fits especially his later, in fact, Scandinavian kingship. His Nordic contingent was swiftly enrolled in the renowned Varangian Guard as properly the elite Byzantine imperial bodyguard unit, primarily composed of Scandinavian and Rus mercenaries valued for their loyalty as foreigners and involved in local politics. Harald Hardrada had already distinguished himself at the service of the Kievan Rus against even, the Poles, other sort of enemies, the Turks, as enemies of Yaroslav the Great. While one Saga tradition in the Flateyjarbók, a major Icelandic manuscript compilation of king's sagas from the late 14th century, hints that Harald initially sought to downplay his princely Norwegian origins as half-brother to the martyred King Olaf Haraldsson, later canonized as Saint Olaf, Norway's patron saint, killed at the Battle of Stiklestad in 1030, after which, in fact, Harald risked, or even in the same, though he was apparently kept a bit aside from the fray by his same uncle, king. The majority of sources affirm that Harald's identity and growing martial fame were already recognized again in Eastern circles, facilitating his rapid promotion until he was he probably was appointed to command the entire Varangian corps under the Emperor Michael I the Paphlagonian, who ruled between 1034 and 1041. He was a former money changer who rose to power through marriage to Empress Zoe. We covered this in our videos about Byzantine history. This is worth stressing because of the strong ties existing at this point between Constantinople and Kiev, and so the fact that Harald had a preferential pathway to that role that would have, however, not been enough in order to basically take over the entire Varangian Guard command in Constantinople. His first major duties addressed the severe 11th century piracy crisis afflicting Mediterranean trade routes, where Arab corsairs, so essentially Islamic, but at some point actually also Byzantine pirates from North Africa and the Levant, demanded capable naval commanders. All right. About the so-called Saracens, we have, in fact, probably had built a bit kind of a let's say, catastrophistic view. Not much because they weren't actually a problem, of course, for the Christians, but because we tend to simply racialize them in terms of those were actually the Arabs, were something else, and largely the Saracens, as we call them, were at least first of all in some part even Christian, and they came also from areas like the broader Byzantine world, southern Italy, Spain. So they weren't merely foreigners, aliens to the system. And in fact, we have to talk a bit more about the Saracens, because when you understand how, for example, they could partially do what they did, it is because they were used as pawns by the same Western powers at large. Right, for reasons that are a bit not flattering. It's a bit like saying, I don't know, why could the Magyars swarm across Central Europe? Well, if it hadn't been a German prince brokering deals with them just to escape sort of power concentration policies from the side of the King of the Western Franks, that thing would have not happened. The same actually goes with the Vikings, right? This is very much the case for Gaul, partly also the one for Britain, as we've seen also in different incidents. For example, the same one, the same herring of the North by William the Conqueror, but before, for example, the Battle of Brunanburh. And by context, that there were lots of Brits there that were trying to oppose essentially the power concentration in the same Britain. And in any case, unequivocally lost, just like all these second invaders. Now, what is interesting here is the fact that Harald's story is fairly well documented. So as a major Norse leader, commander, backed by one of the single most advanced militaries of the era. In fact, Harald's men manned agile Uzii warships, light, fast Byzantine patrol vessels designed for anti-piracy operations. Those were sort of more similar to the ships that the Vikings normally used, not necessarily in the North Sea per se, because mostly like Mediterranean warfare was a slightly different affair, but let's say the Norse were very skilled at that level of sort of smaller scale engagements. They also had, as you know, pretty sizable naval battles on their own with hundreds of vessels, but here it was mostly like cat and mice kind of game, where in fact the enemy was also elusive, and therefore you had to go a bit their own way also just to catch them. Typically, the crews of these Uzii were around 110, 160. The ships were designed for speed, each with complement of about essentially this base of 100 sailors and 50 dedicated marines, at least in the bigger figure. These ships were considerably smaller than the formidable dromons that were sort of the standard galleys, even though there was a bit of a variety of that. I'm preparing a video about the dromons. The dromons were often crewed with over 200 men, right? They were also often, at least, or stereotypically even equipped with siphons for projecting the famous, the proper name would be sea fire or liquid fire. People know it just by was like Greek fire from an external attribution to the Byzantines, projected under pressure to ignite enemy ships. I made a video about Byzantine sea fire as a distinct, in fact, chapter, sort of Byzantine naval warfare, and we have there debunked a bit the fact that it was this big of a secret and that this was this great game changer. This is notorious historiographically speaking. For different literary, cultural reasons, the Byzantines described themselves in fashions that weren't even properly to be taken literally at the time, because they corresponded to certain styles, and then sort of just the moderns just read that and started to probably overemphasize the importance of such weapons. In any case, there is no doubt that the Byzantines had traumatically advanced Byzantine military technology both on land and at sea. Think about the Nicephorian cataphracts, these sort of dromons with flamethrowers mounted on their prow. So as stereotypical as it is, the Byzantines would fight sort of in more also scattered ways, and including like these foreign elements. The results were extraordinary, especially under such a great leader. In fact, Harald Sigurdsson's vessels conducted extensive patrols throughout the Aegean Sea between Greece and Asia Minor, and likely extended to positions off Sicily, the strategically vital island largely under Islamic control and contested at this point by the Byzantines, to protect, essentially for the empire, maritime corridors connecting Italy to North Africa, while complementary operations advance inland into the same Anatolian peninsula in modern Turkey, across, especially, in fact, the continental dimension. At this point, the Byzantines controlled the hinterland of Asia Minor. They will lose it in a couple of generations, but there was also a coastal dimension with towns and strongholds harboring or supporting the Mediterranean pirates that these Varangians were sent to find and eradicate. Successes against Arab shipping proved highly profitable, as evidenced in Saga accounts from the Flateyjarbók, with the emperor requiring only a modest fixed payment of 100 marks per captured pirate vessel, permitting Harald and his followers to keep the abundant remaining plunder and thereby accumulate significant personal wealth. This strategy is very interesting because it shows to a degree how much we also overrate a little bit the Byzantine Empire. I mean, they had the money to pay these soldiers. By the way, I don't even like the term mercenary for the Varangians or for any other trooper, really. But they didn't want to simply involve themselves in any major operation. Piracy was a plague, especially ever since Islam had taken over the Mediterranean. Once again, things had become more unstable already in late antiquity. But as you know, there was albeit sort of universal clash between Christianity and Islam, ideally, a much more fragmented reality, as we were just hinting about before concerning the Saracens. And so basically these Norse soldiers who had historically been Norse pirates, because the Vikings did what they did in the north and beyond, already also in the Mediterranean on their own, they were really the best element, just not to train other Byzantine crews, marines, and so on, and simply saying, if you go after these pirates and you capture the ships, if you storm their nests, you can't get just this fixed sum that was not really symbolic, but obviously also inducing the Varangians on their own to go after the bigger preys, and then all the rest they could keep. So there is already a very important level of subcontracting that unfortunately for the empire, will become typical across this century. Right, the Great Basil II had already passed, and the period that fundamentally goes from that to the rise of the Komnenians that we fairly well documented on Schwerpunkt, all in all, was one of decay, of sort of loss of territory, of general laxism due to political carelessness, lack of funds. And so that broader process of privatization and oligarchization, so this articulation of a public, strong, solid public statal authority that the Macedonian dynasty had definitely tried in the previous generations to maintain alive, and that goes in parallel with the general decline, in fact, of Byzantine civilization at this point, with the same so-called golden age of Islam, with actually dramatically mounting Franco-Roman, Latin Germanic civilization was basically taking over the world system through a mechanism that paradoxically had been born so much from its sort of especially Frankish roots in a de facto feudal sense, of vassalic beneficiary one, that had in its sort of compactness, in its hypertrophic development, paradoxically becoming a glue. Right, it wasn't a moment of destruction; it was a moment of cohesion, and in this, of course, papal spiritual hegemony had a great role. And you can argue that the Byzantines had tried to concentrate power excessively in a way that had become really sclerotic in many ways. But this is also going a bit beyond. But it's important because from a Norse perspective, in this context, it felt easy to fit this game, because there were so many gaps left open that you were given by the same Byzantine authority this free reign on a large part of this war. It's as if they had directed a Viking activity deliberately, especially in the eastern and central Mediterranean, to secure, naturally, also what was the Byzantine, sort of the broader Byzantine dominion. By 1035, firmly established as leader of all Varangians, according to chroniclers such as the 12th century Icelandic historian Snorri Sturluson, author of the Heimskringla, a key collection of Norwegian kings' sagas. We also talked about him in the video about medieval Iceland, but also obviously medieval Norway. But as you know, those lands were very much interconnected. Harald took part in sweeping campaigns that successfully expelled Islamic forces from Anatolia eastward and southeastward, traversing Armenia and Syria. So we're talking actually land expeditions. These territories were called by the Norse, in a loose sense, as the Zerkland. That is to say, the Norse term for Islamic lands, literally the Saracen land. So this is a transliteration from Greek, actually, because the name of Saracens, as you know, is derived from an ancient Sinai Peninsula tribe known as the Sarkenoi, and there as a synecdoche, sort of in the west, came to be known, and also in the Byzantine Empire as Saracens. That were the Muslims in general, right? Even though, as we've seen, some of them were not even Muslim. This is very interesting because it means that Harald penetrated deep into Islamic lands in the east. There is a debate regarding how far. Some say deep into Mesopotamia, along the courses of the Euphrates and Tigris rivers, the major waterways in modern Iraq. That's an area that the Byzantines had been gradually, as creepingly, recover from the north, from Armenia, in fact, and that was succeeding, even in threatening the northern outskirts of the core, at least, of the Abbasid Caliphate. Eventually, these lands will be lost, as you well know, to the Seljuk Turks, especially after the Seljuk victory at Manzikert. That wasn't the reason why Anatolia, however, fell. As we explained, it was because John Balliol, the Norman mercenary that had been installed in the east, was sort of, because of Byzantine jealousy, taken out by the young, by the way, Alexius Komnenos, the still general at the time, and that basically broke the dam the Turks swept across Anatolia. Because Alparslan had also been kind of defeated, had attempted to break through, but had not really succeeded. So I made an entire video explaining how Manzikert is actually not the decisive reason why Anatolia was lost back then. Now, Harald's personal skald, like in the best warrior bard, sort of knightly, almost Minnesang tradition, Theodulf, Arnor's son, a court poet whose verses are preserved, in fact, in sagas, and celebrated Harald's role in the capture of 80 Islamic fortified positions. So a lot of siege warfare, as was typical in the era. This is a strikingly high, telling the truth, but not implausible figure in the estimation of modern historians, given that, again, these areas were also historically very, very populated, were fortified. Like, strongholds can mean also a bit everything. If you crush like an Islamic force in battle, maybe, I don't know, they're going to give away just 10 towns without fighting in certain areas. We don't know of any sort of major operation, like in grand scale regional fashion. However, we know that the Varangians had pushed that far, probably even just on their own, as it was the case also for the free reign given by the Byzantines at sea. During these same early years under Michael IV, Harald contended with Pecheneг nomadic threats along the empire's variegated frontiers, illustrating how the Varangian Guard operated on nearly every border, as Snorri himself observed. This is incredibly fascinating because, albeit there had always been sort of Pecheneг troops at this point in Byzantine army itself, and the thing was definitely accelerating by the time of the Komnenians. Basically, we have this core army of Constantinople, plus essentially just lots of nomads as the field army overall. There were provincial forces as well, but things in terms of probably the older idea of the peasant soldiers had been evaporating due to the hyperpower, in fact, of the oligarchs, of the major estates owners, that the Varangians could fight the sort of nomadic way as well, or against these nomads. This is particularly obvious considering that Harald and many other Varangians had served in the Kievan Rus. I recently made a video about Ruthenian tactics at this point. Also made one about the destruction, essentially, of the Khazar Khaganate. And so there you realize how much mounted horse archery warfare existed to begin with, and how, in fact, Varangians would at large been trained to fight in the same way. Again, Harald himself had been fighting against those Turks, also against peoples that at this point in history had a pretty consistent amount of mounted troops, such as the Poles, in lighter armed fashions. We talked about Polish tactics during this earlier era. So again, there was no theater in which these military professionals could and would not operate. There was always some new land to plunder. Those Pecheneck lands had already been stormed historically by the Slavs, by the Rus, and in this sense, the Vikings that had come to rule in Eastern Europe themselves. If you're interested in all these dynamics that are quite sort of entwined, I made lots of videos on the topic. You can find it in especially the Kievan Rus, sort of also Ruthenian history playlist. Now, contemporaneous with these eastern pushes, and most plausibly following the 1036 peace agreement negotiated by Michael IV with the Fatimid Caliph al-Mustansir Billah, this was the Shia ruler of Egypt and Levant, then a child under regency of his mother, woman of original Byzantine Christian ancestry, as a matter of fact, and that was tendentially, to say the least, a rival contender for the control of all Islam with the Abbasids of Baghdad, that, as we've seen, were the ones against which the Byzantines had sent the same Harald. This treaty reopened commercial exchanges with Egypt and explicitly authorized Byzantine efforts to repair the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the holy site in Christianity in Jerusalem damaged by earlier Fatimid orders. In this period, that was a very important step, because it sort of paved the way also for example, Normans in places like France, Italy, to escort pilgrims to the Holy Land. Paradoxically, also the later fall of Jerusalem in the hands of the Seljuk Turks that were working on behalf of the Abbasids would do nothing but strengthen properly the strategy, the logistics of these armed pilgrimages, turning eventually into the crusade, right? So the Fatimids had actually been enemies with the Byzantines. I will likely make soon new videos on the topic. So the Eastern Mediterranean dimension in general had brought to friction between these two major powers, but at a point it was a new moment of prosperity. And so there was also a great freedom of transit within Islamic-held Jerusalem for Christians. It's at this point, in fact, that Harald undertook his documented journey to the Holy Land, right? And so with all its biblical heritage and so on, and during this window where Saga traditions variously portrayed the venture as either a lavish gift-bearing pilgrimage or outright conquest, modern scholarship deems both unlikely. Instead, Harald and his company almost certainly formed an armed escort protecting, in fact, Byzantine architects, masons, craftsmen, and distinguished pilgrims traveling to oversee the restoration works of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, while confronting bandits who preyed upon Christian visitors along the pilgrimage roads. And so doing, interestingly enough, exactly what, as we've seen, the the Siculo-Normans would basically had already started to do it at this point from southern Italy for the Latin pilgrims in Western Europe. So in this case, the Varangians escort instead the Greeks to Jerusalem. As part of probably some broader delegation or something that had to be supervised as an enterprise by this armed presence. And this was a great chance, of course, for Harald to visit yet another great city in the Levant, such as Jerusalem. In 1037, or more precisely 1038, Harald joined the formidable expedition mounted by the ambitious general Georgius Maniakes, right, prominent Byzantine commander of possible Armenian origin, known for his fierce temperament, rendered as Girge in Saga Norse nomenclature, aimed at wresting Sicily from the established Islamic Emirate to reassert Byzantine influence in the Western Mediterranean. I made multiple videos on all the various dominations in medieval Sicily, so if you're interested in the chronology, some further detail, we also discussed this already in our Byzantine sort of manualistic history series. We'll come back on that. What is interesting, by the way, is that already some Norman mercenaries had been de facto present in the island. This was not a sort of compact Islamic state, right? Islamic Sicily was actually very fragmented. It is definitely one of the most overrated governments. I mean, it is true that Palermo was a major city, was mostly like a massive commercial hub. But let's say, in fact, the existence of a overarching domination of the island by Islamic lords is not quite there. In fact, the fragmentation, the rivalries will bring to some collapse. And some of them were friends, for example, with some of the Normans that in fact entered Sicily because part of these local Muslims opened the gates to them. But there were some, Orthodox monks in the mountains surviving out there. The larger majority of the population was Christian, was Latin, right? And so that's yet another very interesting chapter. Now, Maniakes' expedition to Sicily is very famous. It's the last big Byzantine expedition to the island. In the 12th century, the Comnenians will try to, if anything, destroy the Siculo-Norman kingdom, but they wouldn't quite even get as far as Sicily, right? And this Byzantine army was a multinational force incorporating 300 heavy cavalry Normans. So this is also very interesting because Harald participated to this expedition where there were Varangians at his command, but also actual Normans from Normandy. Norman already at this point is a bit of a synecdoche. There were other sort of French, Germans, Italians, and so on. But it's very important to highlight already the distinction that existed within the same army between two very different civilizational products, right? This Normans were largely from southern Italy. They would include future leaders like William Ironarm of the Hauteville family, just to give an idea of what we're talking about. And the whole force also was drawn at large from Salerno in southern Italy alongside Longobard troops, plus the elite Varangian contingents. Tomorrow, or today actually, when this will be uploaded, I will have participated to Eastern Roman history live stream documenting the situation just the generations before the time of Basil II. So if you're interested, you explain why were the Longobards there, also basically cooperating with the Byzantines. It's complex, right? Southern Italian history is particularly complex. Imagine the school of war that Harald had at this point, like the opportunity of fighting coordination with renowned Norman adventurers, the ones that really would land in Britain the same year he would. And so properly measuring what was going on across Europe as a whole, right? For example, the very thickly packed heavy cavalry charges that the Normans were really specializing in, thanks to the sort of Western Frankish vassalatic beneficiary model that we're discussing, for something very different from what existed in Scandinavia, and that was sort of barely coagulating at this point. Here we see figures like we said it before, William Ironarm, the early Norman conqueror in Italy. Amid demanding amphibious phases, Harold secured an essential beachhead that facilitated the primary army's disembarkation. These Varangians were the best for that type of action because they were, first of all, very skilled in amphibious warfare due to their Viking experience. They were mostly heavy infantry forces. As such, they would be the best to seize the beaches and create, in fact, a beachhead for the rest of the army to land. Also, they subsequently contributed to the seizure of multiple fortified urban centers in the Sicilian hinterland, all right, where mostly northeastern and say in eastern Sicily. Saga compilations record at least 4 such towns falling under Harald's influence, at least, with one captured through ingenious deception rather than direct assault. This was typical. There were lots of sagas insisting on the sort of trickster dimension of cunning, right? Naturally, sagas are relatively legendary, but it's not like the Norse weren't habituated to work in this way. Naturally, the reality was a bit less romantic, a bit more brutal, but we know this very well because literary things are something, reality is something, but reality is actually cooler even. As we were saying before, these successes were possible thanks to divisions among the Saracens. These Saracen seigneuries were all very local, all very scattered. They didn't put up any sort of major coordinated defense. There was no state to actually carry out an effective provincial response. This is a provincially scaled operation, right? It's not really the major, for example, one that Basil II would have taken under had he not died actually in the preparation of. And in any case, this situation, this balance of power allowed the offenders to achieve early territorial advances in the island's eastern sectors that were also historically the ones that had fallen the last, right, having been garrisoned mostly by local troops. Sort of the Sicilians put up a ferocious resistance to Islamic advance. In fact, lasted more than sort of essentially a century. And the Byzantines were, in theory, to save the island, and the last strongholds, such as Taormina, for example, were some of the last to fall, because they were just closer to Constantinople, but at the same time, the thing had varied. The Byzantines had carried out different waves of attempts at a reconquest in southern Italy along the coastline that had been particularly effective. Sicily was a bit bigger and especially like a thing on its own. So once you had created a foothold, you had to continue supplying that. So the best would have been just a major attempt at reconquest. But also the situation of southern Italy was most of the time not so great. The Byzantines tried with what they had, but they were mostly involved in other theaters where most of their resources were concentrated in the east. In fact, the Muslims were not even this radical threat at this point. Despite, however, promising initial conquests, mounting tensions and rivalries within the Byzantine high command culminated in Maniakes' abrupt recall and imprisonment around 1040, undermining the campaign's momentum and allowing Islamic forces to regain much lost ground. With the Sicilian enterprise curtailed by 1041, unrest flared in southern Italy as a Longobarд revolt allied with Norman interests challenged Byzantine authority in Apulia and Calabria. They were essentially the main sort of provinces that the Byzantines had maintained in the Italian mainland. Harald and the Varangians were redeployed there for such reason under Catapan Michael Doceianus, the Byzantine governor of Italy, to stem this expanding Norman presence. They had become ever more pernicious. The Normans were really good at what they did, but they also had the support essentially of the Italic, of the Latin world. In many ways, even though they hadn't yet sort of familiarized with the papacy, but they were absolutely understanding the crisis that Byzantine southern Italy was going under, especially considering the sort of reckless behavior of the Constantinopolitan court, the lack of funds of force from a military point of view. This was a moment of great wealth in general after the reconquest of Basil II, but also of stagnation and gradual erosion of Byzantine power. And the Normans were definitely quite eager to exploit that. And this is also paradoxical in as much Harald, ironically, came to oppose many of the same mercenaries that he had been fighting alongside on Sicilian soil. Those same Normans that had been fighting with the Byzantines would be found pretty much elsewhere. Again, also from the Islamic side at some point. Now, the contingent of the Varangians registered preliminary successes against the rebels, yet suffered severe setbacks in pitched battles, most famously at Olivento in March and Montemaggiore in May of 1041. Severe setbacks inflicted by armies now commanded by their former comrade William Ironarm. In the wake of these defeats, compounded by Maniakes' ongoing detention and pressing priorities elsewhere, the Varangian Guard received orders for withdrawal to the capital. We should point out that this was not the entirety of the Varangian Guard. There were normally also regiments stationed in the Catapanate of Italy, some, again, regiments similar in size to the original personal force of Harald. Later in that eventful year of 1041, imperial attention shifted northward to confront a serious Bulgarian uprising under Peter Delian, claiming to the restored Bulgarian throne, that imperiled the Balkan provinces. We are a generation after Basil II's settlements. The Bulgarians had been destroyed as an empire, but not as a people, so there was always this routine rebellions from the hinterland. If you're interested, I made videos about both the First and the Second Bulgarian Empire. Harald participated prominently in the suppression of the Bulgarians, helping secure a conclusive victory at the Battle of Ostrovo, and thereby acquiring the lasting skaldic epithet Bulgara Brenner, burner of Bulgars. Quite interestingly, because, again, the Norse were quite interesting people from a psychological point of view. They were excited by fire, blood, similar things. Again, think about the Nibelungenlied, going out there to do what? To basically die, but after having, been surrounded by heaps of corpses of your slain enemies, having drank each other's blood, like, of course, as to keep fresh. I mean, it's like the fortification set on fire, like during the twilight of the gods, in that sense, inflicting death of the enemy, if you could do that as well. So the sheer level of traumatic brutality that happened in the Balkans that are also much less documented, in particular for this reason. Like when you have more documented areas, you know that civilization still worked. The warfare was sort of more destructive in absolute terms because there were more means, but things were kept relatively more civilized. You were defeated, okay, regime change, things work smoothly in that direction, but as it's going to happen with the Normans in southern Italy. In the Balkans, as you know, it's this continuously predatory, destructive situation. It's pure mess, right? It's basically almost everybody against everybody, and the consequences in terms of losses are really felt, and definitely thanks to Harald's Varangians for their destructive zeal displayed. Now, recognition from the Byzantine court followed in measured but meaningful promotions. After the Sicilian exertions, designation as Manglabites, a mid-level Byzantine court guard title often paired with Protospatarius, upon conclusion of the Bulgarian operations while stationed at Mysonopolis, advancement to Spatarocandidatus, a relatively modest Byzantine court dignity for foreigners, a dignity the roughly contemporary strategicon of Caecaumenus, an 11th century Byzantine military manual by the namesake general, who personally knew Harald as Araltes, as a matter of fact, in Greek, characterizes as comparatively humble within the full hierarchy, particularly considering Harald's standing. Right? Yes, he was a foreigner, but he was of high enough, essentially of royal blood. And though the author, the aforementioned author, notes that the recipient harbored no resentment over these appointments, the sort of the issue remained. Like there is continuous obedience also towards the empire. It's not like this Varangians could simply take over in a broader sense. So Harald, in this case, earned praise instead for sustained loyalty and affection towards the empire that reportedly persisted long after his return north. So he probably understood how messed up the situation was. It's not like he came from a place where things were better. And so, in general, he was stunned by the magnificence of Byzantine civilization, and he made an enormous treasure out of that military experience. Also, in material terms, because he did actually take home a lot of wealth and amass that in Kiev. By the reckoning preserved in verses of his called Theodulf Arnarsson, Harald had engaged in no fewer than 18 major battles across his Byzantine years. Even though here major battles is mostly battles that you do not hear of on history books. We're talking engagements of, again, like hundreds, thousands of men against one another. This is a testament to the relentless pace of service spanning nearly a decade. It was important for the Norse to be there. It's a bit like the later knightly ethos. It's a big deal for a fighter to have acquired his chevrons by, after battle, tournament after tournament. The greatest ambition is to fight and even die at some point in major engagements. So here, as you understand, Harald never commanded in person dramatically large amounts of troops yet. However, he earned a massive experience looking at the entire sort of military machine of the Byzantines, fighting, as we've seen here, in all theater, basically, in every country, in the empire, in every kind of operation. And this is way more valuable than gold, as we'll see now also for his Scandinavian return. Just in time, by the way, because the accumulated Byzantine goodwill evaporated sharply following the death of Michael IV in December 1041. In the brief, ill-fated rule of his nephew and adopted heir, Michael V, who reigned until 1042, known as Caliphates, whose short reign ended, in fact, in deposition. It was insecurities regarding the Varangian attachments to the previous regime prompted drastic measures. Harald endured arrest himself, like confinement on accusations that vary across traditions. Sagas emphasize embezzlement of imperial revenues or a rejected marriage proposal to a supposed relative of Empress Zoe, the very famous, influential Macedonian dynasty empress co-ruler multiple times, named Maria, according to this version, and that Zoe allegedly as sapphically coveted for herself, whereas external accounts like those of William Malmesbury and Saxo Grammaticus, again, they are not too close sources, but still they are importantly sort of a bit more detached, cite offenses such as defiling a noble woman or homicide, with historians suggesting underlying political motives, of course rooted in perceived threats from the guards' prior allegiances, which is definitely also the most realistic mechanism. That what happened at the Byzantine court naturally was pretty messed up from every side, including the Varangian one. Now, the situation deteriorated further when Michael V attempted to sideline and exile the powerful Empress Zoe, because again, we made a video about her, we know that very well, igniting popular insurrection throughout Constantinople. It's at that point that Harald gained release during this upheaval. Narratives diverged between tales of audacious, self-orchestrated breakout and strategic liberation arranged to cultivate Varangian sympathy for the counter-coup, and sources attribute to him direct involvement or at least subsequent claims of personally binding the overthrown emperor prior to his forced monastic confinement, as it was really normal for rulers of the time, in particular in the Byzantine Empire, as Zoe reclaimed authority in June 1042 through marriage to Constantine IX Monomachos, who would rule up to 1055. Even with stability restored, Harald's formal petition to depart the court and repatriate his amassed riches met refusal. Because partially, again, this had been kept in Constantinople, and even the connections with Kiev had not worked to unblock this massive amount of loot that the Byzantines also wanted to maintain for themselves. This was a great risk also for the Varangians in service of the empire. Now, over the course of his eastern tenure, Harald compiled extraordinary fortunes exceeding ordinary campaign spoils through prudent annual transfers of treasure northward, as we were saying before, to the safekeeping of Grand Prince Yaroslav the Wise in Kiev, that was loyal to him, supplemented by 3 documented participations in the distinctive Varangian practice termed as Polutsvarf, that in Old Norse stands for palace plundering, right? A customary right allowing Varangians to root imperial treasuries during succession transitions. This was a very common mechanism in pre-modern Europe. Like this happened, for example, also in the Papal Curia at the death of every pope. Like the servants, other people could take, what they could from his apartment. The Venetian doges as well, the same way. It was really normal. Essentially, this sanctioned access during transitional moments accompanying imperial death or accession. So it's more than the loot itself. It's a political involvement that also required a highly risky military guard duties, as well as opportunities that aligned precisely with the passings of Romanos III, Michael IV, and Michael V, affording legitimate avenues for substantial additional enrichment beyond regular entitlements and widely regarded as underpinning Harald's later Scandinavian ambitions. Resolute despite the denial, Sigurd's son orchestrated a meticulously timed escape in the summer of 1042, likely August, to coincide with preparations of the annual Kievan merchant fleet heading upriver. We described this in our recent video about Ruthenian tactics and how swift the crossing for weather control, in fact, the waters at least, across this major eastern riverways was on a also seasonal basis. You loot and plunder across, the Black Sea and beyond during the good season. And then as the first calls arrive, they arrive fairly early there, you go back north with loot and so on. Selecting 2 galleys crewed by trusted retainers and laden heavily with accumulated gold, Harald executed a nocturnal sortie toward the massive iron chain stretch across the Golden Horde entrance as a primary defense. This evidently also prevented, this kind of treasures to escape the city too easily. And approaching the barrier, this is of course according to legend in any case, Harald directed the oarsmen aft to elevate the prow sufficiently for the chain to pass beneath the keel, allowing the vessel to slide over and into open waters upon shifting weight forward, though the pursuing second galley fractured its hull on the obstacle and foundered with severe casualties. And so it's all a bit adventurous, but it fits the context. Clearing the Bosphorus into the Black Sea unimpeded, Harald evaded any pursuit and completed the voyage back to Kievan Rus by autumn. However things went, whether it was actually helped by this or that, the Byzantine faction is unknown, but you can, in a sense, understand it. There is no doubt that, in any case, he did go through danger at different times in this enterprise. Because, touring the Black Sea loaded in gold in the early 11th century is not really very recommended in general. Now, upon the re-entry into Yaroslavl's domain that very fall, 1042, Harald finalized his long-anticipated marriage to the prince's daughter Elisif, known as Elisif in Norse sources, linking Harald to major European dynasties in this case. Elisif was herself of Norse blood because as granddaughter to the Swedish monarch Olof Skotkonung, the annihilance of elevated prestige matching Yaroslav's other careful dynastic placements with the royal houses of Western Francia, the Magyars, and even the same Constantinople through Constantine the Ninth. We described how important these international marriages were, how much the same Byzantine Rus bond at this point relied on that. The Byzantines were essentially helping their own allies in this sphere that we've seen was not very much like the Latin one, because they hated, again, the Franks, the Normans, and everybody countering their power, as we've seen also in Italy. Evidence suggests that betrothal had been contemplated or tentatively arranged during Harald's prior Rus residence, deferred only until his material success rendered him suitable, right? And there's this poignant love stanza composed amid his Constantinopolitan service, because these warriors were also bards in their own regard. This was completely normal. It would live on in European literary tradition in the later centuries. And in this piece, Harald lamented how the goddess of Gardarike, that is the Norse name for Kievan Rus, as for Kiev actually, spurned his offered gold rings, and is explicitly linked by Snorri Sturluson to Elisif, because the name is not revealed, but it's understandable. There are variant traditions in the Morkin Skinna depicting Harald reminding Yaroslav of earlier commitments upon return. In any case, it's beautiful and poetic, because also some important archetypal and universal beliefs at the time. We haven't still made a video about the Rex Nemorensis, the role of the woman as the soul of chivalry, the angel of victory. And so this crowning achievement, so in a genetic sense, one of new life creation and so on, but it is part of all this game. Harald almost certainly furnished detailed intelligence concerning Constantinople's fortifications and military dispositions in preparation for Yaroslav's ambitious retaliatory expedition of 1043, which still happened at this point in history. In fact, the Rus assembled an imposing armada of approximately 400 vessels, characterized by broader beams and sturdier timbering adapted for riverine navigation, yet evocative of Baltic Viking longships. I also made a video about those, as a matter of fact, for our warship series, under the command of Yaroslav's son, Prince Vladimir. Now, this is also very important because, as you understand, Harald was the best connection to provide with a very detailed, almost photographic head. Of course, that being invented would have even been like, you see, this Norse would be able to look beyond mere material matters. It was about like sort of eyeballing how like an operation could be launched, putting that together like as an immediate providential assessment. The Byzantine-Rus relations were still turbulent regardless of the sort of historical alignment already. And in any case, the Rus did not really have the capacity to, say, take over Constantinople. In fact, this formidable military expedition met catastrophic failure, first battered by violent Black Sea tempests en route that are always present. And again, it's always a big risk. And then the incineration by defensive volleys of sea fire, an outcome that, at least alleged, signaled the effective cessation of large-scale Varangian enlistments by the empire at that point. Because it is the same route from which these troops had come, as you understand it. So Harald's life marks also this sort of important stage in Byzantine-Rus relations and in Varangian Guard activity. It's a long history. It lasts for centuries, but it wasn't just like a fixed institutionalized matter. All right, it was just like a big international clienteling mechanism rather than anything. The sagas offered no explicit mention of Harald's battlefield participation. By the way, in the latter expedition, though, his intimate court connections rendered at least some advisory or auxiliary role conceivable. Harald lingered another 3 years within Rus territories, dividing time between Kiev and Novgorod, where he methodically constructed a naval infrastructure supporting the eventual 400-mile return passage to Norway, undertaken in autumn 1045. You can understand how many Norse were still stationing, especially in the north, how much the local Slavic principalities were in part run even just by blood. They had married into the local aristocracy. Talking the Vikings de facto. But how these powers were all involved also in Scandinavian affairs. We have never made a history of these relations between Scandinavia and Eastern Europe, but they were quite direct, and especially with Kiev, this was also possible, right? That was the main sponsor for Harald, especially considering his new marriage tie now. And by then, Harald was a seasoned 30-year-old commander accompanied by veterans, many of whom had served under him for over a decade, of extraordinary adventures and astonishing military experiences. Harald's fleet groaned under the weight of transported gold, as noted by skulls upon reaching Swedish ports like Sigtuna late that year or early 1046. This was all instrumental to it, if you think about it. This whole career, also because he had been exiled, as we said before, after the Battle of Stiklestad. Norway at his arrival lay under the stable rule of his nephew Magnus I Olafsson the Good, who ruled between 1035 and 1047. He was legitimate son of the sainted Olaf, recalled from exile following the death of Knut the Great to assume the throne in 1035. We've never really made a video about Knut the Great, that just by nickname deserves one instead. And so basically the original line, right, of Norwegian rulers had been reinstalled after essentially this major Danish dominion across northern and northwestern Europe had basically faded away. Magnus further secured proclamation as King of Denmark himself. Like, this was completely normal. It was mostly just some condition of power sharing rather than sort of some direct rule, as you know, but it was still indicative of many of the connections that would be later fostered between the sort of among the various Norse monarchies. King of Denmark 1042, after Artaknut's demise, prevailing over initial challenges from Svein Estrid's son without recorded internal disturbances, marring his Norwegian reign. Harald's unanticipated reappearance upended this equilibrium. Forging a temporary coalition with the displaced Svein and Swedish King Anund Jakob, he initiated provocative raids along Danish shores intended to discredit Magnus's protective capacity on the Jutland Peninsula and encourage, in fact, local defections. This tells you how sort of easy it was to make leverage on this Scandinavian sort of proto-states. Again, it would take really a lot before, let's say, things would consolidate, compared especially to Western European standards. In any case, here the dynamic is even more interesting because Denmark was by far the more powerful country of the Scandinavian ones, and the, again, recognition of leadership dynastically just by authority, it was a mix of factors, was relatively feeble from Norway. Norway did not have the interland capacity to simply subjugate Denmark, right? If anything, historically would be the other way around, when things in fact would more functionalize. At this point, it was more like recognizing a faction in charge, regardless of the actual sort of control. This also shows how ambitious Harald was, because again, he was at that point just wanting the Norwegian throne, and more, evidently. This was, however, considered fair play, especially in the north, as more fixed forms of power recognition were not really accepted. Everything was more like, if you have the power, let's see it, and then you'll be in charge if you deserve it. Alerted to the escalating threat, Magnus returned with full forces, however, royal councillors advocated accommodation over fratricide. Right, the resulting 1046 accord elevated Harald to co-kingship over Norway alone. You understand how they would switch thrones regardless, again, of the provenance, because it was mostly about being elite and recognized by the establishment in a traditional fashion. This will happen also in later Scandinavian history. Magnus thus preserved primacy on his Danish holdings. So paradoxically, sort of Harald got to Norway, but just by giving the other guy the sort of the more important kingdom. And this was also done by extracting in exchange half of Harald's meticulously gathered eastern fortune to alleviate the younger monarch's fiscal strains. So it's not just he sort of retreated from Norway, but had to pay in order to rule there, not to make his kin to discontent of this switch. So it was essentially a pact, but as unstable as it sounds. The arrangement fostered persistent strain, in fact, with the rivals maintaining separate retinues and courts where recorded meetings repeatedly approach outright violence, which is also very typically Norse at this point in history. A joint Danish campaign in 1047 preceded Magnus's sudden and enigmatic death later that year in Jylland. His final disposition allocating Denmark to Sweyn and Norway to Harald. Proclaiming himself immediate successor to both realms upon the news, interestingly pointing also at an increasingly dynastic inheritance kind of mechanism, which was at least ideally the greatest dream of all those rulers. And again, in other parts of Europe, this was being gradually affirmed. Harald III Sigurdsson moved aggressively to displace his former partner, inaugurating a grueling 17-year struggle against Svein Estridsson, characterized by almost yearly Norwegian incursions from 1048 onwards. So this continuous side switching was extremely typical of the Viking era and even beyond Scandinavia. Employing tactics of rapid, devastating coastal assaults akin to those previously deployed against Magnus, Harald ravaged Jutland extensively, and in 1049 orchestrated the complete destruction by fire and plunder of Edeby, then Scandinavia's preeminent, heavily defended commercial entrepot, whose prosperity and population never revived, leaving the site abandoned after further Slavic depredations in 1066, which are not random at all. And this highlights two dynamics. The first one is very well known that most settlements that had been created during the Viking era, there were older ones as well that sort of survived, at least in part, but Scandinavia did not have a urban net. The settlements were relatively sort of unstable. It was scarcely concentrated surplus. Political upheavals could make things change. And the Viking era prominently features this ring forts established mostly in coastal areas, on islands and so on, like in this case. And basically after the Viking era stopped, and especially the massive slave trade that this entailed from initially like the continent, mostly the British Isles, Ireland, these centers failed. They didn't have any other sort of purpose for existence. Some, of course, remained, but the wide majority of the bigger centers evaporated and were never sort of re-inhabited because they had a merely just commercial logistical function. The other element is very interesting at Harald's death is the fact that this major power vacuum witnesses to the expansion of the Western Slavs into the Baltic to a degree. As we've seen, the Poles had been enemies of Harald, also mostly in their wars against the Rus. So we'll come back to that. Also made some videos about the Piests and their very interesting warfare. Now, Norwegian arms prevailed in the majority of encounters against Sweyn, including one episode where the Swedes outnumbered, reportedly panicked, and drowned attempting aquatic flight, according to Saxo Grammaticus. Yet durable occupation continually eluded grasp. I mean, this This is something that could be barely done even in the late Middle Ages. You can't imagine at this point. But it didn't matter. It was, again, about loot mostly and gathering that much that could fuel further expeditions and larger income in that way. And it's a typically Viking context for what we're habituated to call it like this. Now, the protracted war peaked in the large-scale naval confrontation at Niza on August the 9th, 1062, where both sides fielded fleets approaching 300 vessels. Anticipating prompt engagement, Harald dismissed his former levy contingents, comprising half his strength, when Sweyn delayed appearance, only for the Danish armada to arrive thereafter and compel fierce close quarters combat marked by heavy casualties. Harald personally wielding bow in the opening phases, with some 70 Danish ships left emptied of crews, while Sweyn narrowly escaped with survivors. This tendency towards the more professional corps, as opposed to a generalized Leidang levy that we discussed also in Schwerpunkt, is really preferential. It's better to have less troops, but better equipped, more experienced. If anything, it was transitioning to, okay, there are the professionals, just do that for a living. Let's simply pay them, like let's supply them, as opposed to send untrained levy. It doesn't matter how sort of habituated to brutality the average Scandinavian farmer is, but war at this point is being waged in a big, an unprecedentedly large scale that, however, requires a better usage of resources and their right allocation. Cumulative attrition in lives, resources, and domestic stability, exacerbated by concurrent internal frictions, ultimately compelled negotiation of an unconditional peace settlement in 1064 that confirmed pre-existing boundaries within indemnities or concessions, thereby releasing Harald's capacities for subsequent westward enterprises, culminating in the fateful 1066 English campaign. Within Norway, Harald's formative experiences as a professional commander shaped a governing approach frequently resolved through unyielding force. Cultivating the sobriquet Hardrada from both uncompromising arbitration of disputes and skaldic boasts concerning oaths shattered during Mediterranean service. So again, this word was modernizing and secularizing by the old Norse standards, so to say. Again, the nickname Hardrada is later, as we explained it's later attested, as we explained in the previous episode. However, it sort of fits Harald's iron-fisted government practice. Power concentration efforts prove transformative. This is a positive dynamic, as a matter of fact. Introduction of exclusive royal minting rights yielded, for example, durable coinage widely circulating domestically, often featuring triquetra designs bridging Christian Trinity symbolism with older Norse motives. This channel is, as you know, a bit like the top source for this kind of sort of topics, explanations, but not in videos like this. And also generated steady crown income while facilitating expanded commerce, leveraging Harald's established ties with Kievan Rus, the Byzantine realm, Scotland, and Ireland as well. The connection with the latter two countries was historically intense for the Norse, that, as explained before, had historically been infiltrating the Celtic Fringe, also settling parts of the same. It was also brutalizing the local population, however, also essentially bringing it again, coercing it against the routinely predatory expeditions against the Anglo, especially the Saxon core, right? It was gradually extending its control of the entirety of England, and sort of tendentially in a British hegemonic sense. Now, ecclesiastical policy promoted Christianity's consolidation through deliberate importation of bishops, priests, and monks predominantly from Eastern traditions, however, producing a Norwegian variant subtly distinct from prevailing Northern European forms and evidence archaeologically in numerous church constructions and enhancements during his era. Assertive independence manifested in redirection of Nidaros pilgrimage revenues and appointment of clergy lacking conventional Western consecration, provoking remonstrances from Archbishop Adalbert of Hamburg-Bremen, that was essentially the metropolitan of Northern Europe, at least overseeing the evangelization of this region, to which Harald reputedly countered that he recognized no higher ecclesiastical authority in Norway than the king himself, an attitude contemporaries likened to Byzantine despotic precedent. This detail is incredibly important for a number of reasons. First of all, there is definitely a knowledge through Harald's Eastern adventures of how power worked in Constantinople that had historically controlled the church, differently from the West, where essentially the Pope and the Emperor are on a de facto paritary level. Actually, the West will be overwhelmingly successful exactly because of this. People often think the opposite because they don't study ecclesiastical history nor history in general to understand the outcome. We should say that the Scandinavians at this point could have drawn, again, these models from the East, because, again, this great crescent that we explained before from the Bosphorus to Eastern Europe, Northern Europe, was very much entwined, especially during the Viking era. Traffics, we know that, I don't know, in Britain you find, I don't know, helmets still of Spangenhelm construct, but this was normal also for Scandinavia, but with very specific sort of Eastern European forms of construction up to the Norman conquest, all right, and with some influence even later, due to the French Revolution around the pole that opposed the prevalent Western, the expanding Western civilization in those regions. So in some ways, there was some animosity and antagonism of the Norse towards not just the evangelization of Europe that at that point had become unstoppable, and it was necessary for them to consolidate power as well. And they were fully into, as you see also with Harald, but that had to still say something different, a bit like Arianism back in the day, just a random example. It's a bit like also Celtic Christianity, some prerogatives of the insular churches and so on. It's difficult to point deliberately at an explicitly Byzantine determination in this, because the specificities of the early Scandinavian churches are inherent, mostly like the Norse context, and so how those societies were developing with enormous difficulties compared to continental Europe. I mean, even Germany seemed particularly advanced in that and successful, because the diocese of Hamburg-Bremen was exactly the launching pad for missionaries in Scandinavia, and historically was to control that. And you know that Germany also later in history, even though Scandinavia got eventually its metropolitic see, will constantly try to expand into Sweden, into Denmark, both militarily, economically. We know it very well. Think about Henry the Lion, his connections with Visby, the later 14th century, basically Holstein takeover of the Danish monarchy, politically speaking. So there was an antagonism between these systems, these mechanisms, right? The other element here that really stands out is the fact that is, in the sense apparently more traditional, of considering the earthly ruler, such as Saint Olaf of Norway, killed in battle, and this is very much echoing in northern, you can say military saints, because eventually they were adulterated as some sort of more saintly figure, but these Nordic peoples in particular had a very strong idea of and almost frustrated idea, because they had never really been able to impose themselves as enormous rulers up to this point in history, that again was also still relatively modest, in claiming overlordship over practically any aspect of the community, including the priestly one. right? The early Norse also had their own priesthood that, as you know, tended to, and it was indeed one with the what we would call the secular aristocracy in the same way, and that was keeping the boundaries of this broader establishment, this broader mob, like when conquering new lands during Viking colonization, like saying we have to have an equal repartition, not overstepping one another. The Viking era had largely unhinged this mechanism because of the massive amount of wealth by Scandinavian standards had been injected in Norse society, where at this point, as you understand, these major warlords like Harald, that is a bit like the greatest example of this, had accumulated through loot, through this relentless expeditions and so on. And so the concept of sacred Germanic rule had remained very much archaically connected with a sort of very autonomous management also of any sacerdotal affair. And so further inspired by the Byzantines, they claimed that essentially the king was superior to the clergy, right? They had contacts with the papacy. I mean, think about the same. The Great went over to Rome. Here, Harald also, this is not a papal connection, but he visited Jerusalem. I mean, there was an idea of the broader sense of Christendom and its also hierarchical relevance. But in their home at this point, if anything, the church was being just established by these rulers that saw it as a big change, but in this sense also something that they could personally control. And so the idea that wielding power was truly a matter of manhood, somebody who bore arms, and not a matter of who decides this, the papacy or whatever. This was contentious also for the rest of the West, and we really made lots of videos on the topic because it's not even so simple or straightforward. The papacy had an enormous power that existed for a reason. It was not sort of antagonistic but concurrent with earthly power. It's just like saying, as an emperor, are you fit for that? Like, can you withstand properly the might of a divinely spirited church? Because the church is there exactly to counter any power that is not fit divinity. And that's why it is really necessary also in any archetypal sense. It's not like the counter-cultural thing that some mystical fascists would like to make you believe. And though they knew, some of these mystical fascists definitely knew their deal, but it's impossible to teach the medieval history without realization also what the role of the church was. We just talked about it yesterday indirectly, explaining the meaning of Diana, and that was also a metaphor, like, as you know, the church through the moon later on with the empires, the sun. So there was no doubt there had to be a subordination, but the balance between the two in the West, paradoxically, as it will also fully kick into Scandinavia, was an incredible civilization booster, differently from the Byzantine world where the church sclerotized, as much in the sense by the empire that became ever more autocratic, ever more oppressive towards the same Church of Rome that sort of completely bailed out of the Eastern world at some point. And so this is incredibly important to be seen. Saint Olaf of Norway, even in terms of sacred blood, what was understood in this broader sacrality in an imperial traditional sense. And this sacred blood was understood by Harald being possessed, in fact, by himself as a great ruler, as a great warrior, the one capable of ruling at that point. Hence also his further overseas ambitions, that, however, shipwrecked ruinously. After the war, military reconstruction confined retention of private standing adhered solely to royal prerogative, systematically eroding autonomous magnate power bases. This was also like the practice. That's also why the church helped, because you could constitute some even though Scandinavian monasteries, abbeys were very much privatistic in a sense, but the idea that there were some privileges, some immunities, some exemptions that could essentially, as also in other kingdoms, back a monarchy against lay nobility, private power was used to fund, in fact, the same military, of the same professional soldiery, the hird that already existed in the, of course, in the North Ward as a form of military organization, but at this point ever more maintained by these new institutions. Um, Again, the path to Scandinavian centralization would be incredibly slow. Not because the rulers didn't try, but because really there were just intrinsic limits in the land. Now, foremost among domestic adversaries stood the entrenched dynasty of the Earls of Lade Trøndelag and northern regions, heirs to Earl Hakon Sigurdsson's near sovereign dominance from 975 to 995, and subsequent partial autonomy. By Harald's accession, the line centered on Einar Tambarskjælver, Hakon's son-in-law and prior supporter of Magnus, whose relations with the new king swiftly deteriorated amid absolutist reforms by the time standards. Naturally, there was, as you understand here, a thick opposition to Harald at home as well. An ostentatious Nidaros demonstration by Einar, arriving with 8 or 9 longships and nearly 500 armed retainers, essentially almost like the ones that Harald had arrived with to Constantinople, passed without immediate reprisal. Yet escalating provocations soon precipitated his assassination by Harald's agents around 1050, momentarily threatening broader civil strife but resolved through deft negotiations that secured the family's ultimate capitulation, and extinguished Lade as an oppositional platform, definitively submitting Trøndelag into the national kingdom. You know that Norway, it's obviously like a coastal country at large, and it is segmented on the Atlantic, on the western side coast that is the longest in all these various fjord bays, right? That is a very peculiar geographical physiognomy. You don't have such things in Sweden. Sweden is different. Also, Denmark is different. So, essentially, securing all these various sections latitudinally was initially like a hallmark, properly, of the Norwegian king's capacity to claim overlordship over the entire reign. All right. And it's also interesting in these show-offs that were carried out by veritable military expeditions, because, again, having several longships loaded with hundreds of men and arriving in a place that was normally run by somebody else, it was an enormous affront, right, especially to the king at this point, and ever more loaded with political meaning. Now, parallel resistance crystallized in the historically peripheral uplands interior that were more fringe, right, in general, but there were still prosperous rural communities withholding taxes in solidarity with figures such as Hakon Ivarsson, who had shown at Nisa briefly entertaining prospects of earldom before denial and subsequently received instead Swedish granted Värmland in the further interior, escalating by early 1064 into open defiance that may have influenced willingness for Danish truce at that point. This is also, again, very relevant. Harald countered with incisive expeditions to reassert order. First crossing into Sweden itself to vanquish Hakon, then methodically subjugating districts commencing in Romerike and extending through Hedmark, Hadeland, and Ringerike via targeted farm incinerations, maimings, executions, and confiscations of valuable estates that bolstered royal finances while shattering local resilience. This naturally put into practice was Harald was completely habituated to do across the Mediterranean. On a regular basis, it's not like the Norse are exactly documented having been provided with, particular sensitivity to things like human life or mercy, even these useless things. And obviously, yes, there's sound the fact that these are, again, fringe areas in Europe. We know very few about them. It doesn't mean that this actually contains one of the most shockingly and traumatically violent pictures in the history of mankind. People cut to pieces, eaten, burned alive. Look, we know this very well, by the way, through other comparative anthropological affairs. And again, the Scandinavian hinterland will remain a mess for a very, 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 very long time, right? In the same exact dynamics. I made videos about the entire sort of entail of Scandinavian countries during again, the Middle Ages. So if you're interested in the various histories of the region, you can give it a look. In any case, we will talk more about Scandinavian warfare. Now, by late 1065, these measures had imposed comprehensive tranquility. Again, this is sort of positive stuff, like the fact that this wouldn't go on and on and on because nobody had the power to put an end to violence, paradoxically, was worse, right? Of course, this Iron Fist is much better, and it's already a proof of improvement in general. This had happened through the elimination, the exile, or properly the muting of the remaining descent, and achieving what historians term the initial phase of Norway's national territorial unification under a strengthened monarchy. Again, this is particularly important, that Harald is also this institutional figure. Again, these people knew how to run business, all right? They knew how to maintain order. They knew how to reinforce the establishment. As you understand, also before, there were some brutal eliminations of very important magnates, but just because these had seen that the system was permeable, they could force a hand, and they fell. But after the fall, and this is also, if you study Germanic history, pretty explicit, like the fact that the feud is real, is institutionalized, because also there is really not much of a way to stop it otherwise with a sort of a public authority. But once the guy dies, the feud is recomposed, society has to come back compact, because this is otherwise chronically unstable, right? And the more you see that in the sources in the law, the more you know that how unstable that was. And so this is a gradual improvement. Now, contemporary testimony from Adam of Bremen further records Harald's evident curiosity in maritime exploration beyond familiar domains. This is very interesting. There were always new opportunities opening, especially to the Norwegians, that were, again, the more seafaring of all the Viking peoples. Adam describes ventures far into northern oceans where Harald's ships skirted ominous abyssal limits before prudent withdrawal. Ventures speculated to target legendary Vinland, recently reached by earlier Norse sailors, or perhaps distant Arctic reaches like Spitsbergen or Novaya Zemlya. We don't really know that. The point is that resources were present out there. There was a way to use different positions also as logistical bases. Normally, the Norse had been exploring this areas also, I don't know, as far as the White Sea. So in prohibitive conditions, by the way, but that, however, were somehow, by the desperations of those climates in general, also at home, still providing something. It's not like the history of Iceland, like, a place that was a bit unforgiving, just, if you think about the name, but that was not abandoned, was continuously populated at some point with great effort, but still, because there was something to extrapolate from it. Now, later tradition associates Harald with founding Oslo as a preferred royal seat where he resided frequently. However, it is sort of anecdotal and almost legendary. Naturally, there were different courts, different seas where the court traveled to, and this was necessary just to ensure power control. Oslo naturally is, and is still today, the capital of Norway because of the sort of major fertile plain in the south, more connected strategically to Jutland, to the North Sea, to the Baltic, and so obviously, like, generally increasing in power. But this is also the beauty of it. It's like when you look at the Anglo-Saxon Heptarchy, you realize that literally in a cycle, essentially every single of the main 7 states, even though there were more, at some point held the upper hand, held sway over the others, obtained Bretwalda status, and they often weren't necessarily the most developed. Right, it started with Kent as such, but then, I don't know, think about Mercia that held it the longest before the Saxons took over. So it's not that obvious, and as we were explaining before, at that point it's not much a matter of where's the most developed center. It is, more how many other centers, even poorer ones, are aligned overall, because the differences in absolute terms are not so big, and so at that point number is sort of more important than the quality. But as long as a power increases, of course, it has to found itself towards a tendentially more stable location as well. Collectively, these initiatives, monetary reform, commercial outreach, ecclesiastical self-assertion, aristocratic curtailment, and regional integration solidified Norway's institutional framework by elevating it from fragmented chiefdoms into a more cohesive state poised for ambitious external projection, albeit forged through the stern measures that indelibly marked Harald's legacy as the hard ruler, Hardrada. And this is, in fact, the spirit. And again, we know just that much about his life, and there is no doubt that there is much more, eventually, to his story. The details, we just know that much. This, however, gives you an idea of probably the one of sacred ruler in particular, the ruler of an empire, overseas possession, someone who had really seen the world and knew what this was also heading towards. Like, because when you study 1066, the attitude is, okay, this is the barbarian who arrived there and was destroyed because it was not good, right? And in a sense, it is that. I mean, the Anglo-Danes were already more advanced than the Norwegians, even though, again, the Danes, etc., had controlled the Anglo-Saxon world and the Anglo-Danish world at this point. In fact, still, it's because they had the latter had found it useful to have a guy that at some point had to come back home across the sea, and it's an important constant. But in this sense, remember the relation with the Normans in Sicily, the awareness of Constantinople, the Kievan Rus, other powers around. Harald was not coming from an isolated backwater of Europe, at least he was coming from an area that, although less developed and less stable, was capable of concentrating like an important force that could have opened the path to a continuity, for example, of English history within essentially a more Northern European framework as opposed to a Western one in a fully Franco-Roman sense, right? So, also the Anglo-Danes were Roman in but they had really some specificities. They had different connections. We've seen it before. Even the Norwegian church initially, this was the case for other Catholic places like Moravia, had some Byzantine rather than, in fact, Roman influence. And let's stress the difference between the two, because it does exist. It's not really a matter of personal opinion. And let's also focus in the sense of, however, how advanced the concept is to handle in an area like Scandinavia that has not really known much of a state. And also the fact that Norway was, in its compactness, making sort of important steps before eventually falling sort of behind compared to the other Scandinavian realms, in sort of generating not just Harald, but the preconditions for consolidation of power in his enterprise in Britain. That follows, in that sense, also a path that had already been the Viking one for a very long time, since the 9th century, right? The continent was impracticable at this point, unless you talk about the Eastern Europe. And so we come back to the beginning of this video, like saying, remember that those areas were a bit overrated, a bit overrepresented in pop culture. We must talk about the West. The West was much bigger, much more stable in its substance, right? It was much more resourceful. And so this insistence on the British world as a place still sort of permeable, easy to pray over, this is something that the Norse had decided after having basically weathered too much against Western Francia, that definitely received the greatest sort of impact of the Vikings early on, but also basically reconsolidated. And that's a point where the Great Army in particular goes over to Britain and starts doing something for which the Norse were to stay in great part. And so there's really a lot of history behind this, and on Schwerpunkt I was really thinking about it before as well, like how much medieval Scandinavian history, too few, I think, because again, I really know that we did that, but it's too few, like only 33 videos. This is the 34th. Yeah, initially on Schwerpunkt we used to make this stuff, we have to make a bit more and a bit more in depth, a bit more in detail. Lots of more Viking stuff, but also later Scandinavian history that I personally find also more interesting, telling you the truth. For Scandinavian history as a whole, I have an entire playlist as well, because there is, I don't know, the Swedes of Gustavus Adolphus, other Scandinavian history, so from antiquity. This is the 42nd video. All right. Overall, however, again, yeah, this will be surely a frontier expansion for Schwerpunkt probably in the next few months, because I know also that you like, during this period, some Viking talk. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.